Sallallahu ala Muhammad, Zumayamna ya Muhammad. Sallallahu ala Muhammad, Zumayamna ya Muhammad. Alhamdulillah abada, Zumayamna ya Muhammad.
Greetings, and welcome to my video series about idolatry. I will start with a story. Benjamin Disraeli was the first Jewish Prime Minister of England. It was he who decided Queen Victoria should be Empress of India. One day, he was talking with certain members of the House of Lords. They were discussing their noble Norman ancestry, and they teased Disraeli for being merely a Jew. Disraeli responded, "You should recall that while your ancestors were worshipping pieces of stone, mine were dressed in silver and gold and dancing before the Temple of Solomon." The story is likely apocryphal, but the Prime Minister's rebuke expresses the revulsion invoked by idolatrous practice. In this series of videos, and with all due respect to Benjamin Disraeli, I hope to persuade you that idolatry, as a practice and as a belief system, should be critically reconsidered, especially in the variant known as pantheism. First, I describe idolatry as confining the creator to creation. I then trace the evolution of idolatry into the pantheism of the 17th century philosopher Baruch Spinoza. I will recall the downfall of Aristotelian logic, pausing on the earnest piety of the medieval scholastics, drawing a line then to the secular bravado of the logical positivists, and then to the collapse of rationalism about 100 years ago. I identify the truth of contradiction as cause to venerate two great warriors in the battle against classical rationalism, being Nicholas of Cusa and Kurt Gödel. I then present Spinozan pantheism as an indispensable lens through which to examine our condition. And I do not say this is despite its radical idolatry, but instead because of it. I then present my general defense of idolatry. At that point, I pivot to a critique formulated by Brazilian philosopher and social theorist Dr. Roberto Mangabeira Unger, who objects to the static timelessness of Spinozan pantheism. I then argue that Dr. Unger falls short in describing and prescribing the mutability of time, and I champion a discipline of observation to change the past and resolve our metaphysical predicament. I conclude with the point that some others have made, that pantheism is where atheism shakes hands with religion. I propose to elevate that handshake into friendship. From my own personal perch as a Trinitarian Christian, I will mention briefly the idolatry implicit in my own religion, while I will make reference to practices and beliefs in Judaism and Islam. I will try to stay in my own lane. I argue from one axiom only, namely, that all fruit trees bear fruit, or, in the words of the English poet William Blake, everything possible to be believed is an image of the truth. Any discussion of idolatry must start with the Jews. It was an entirely novel idea in the ancient world that one should identify and condemn a form of worship found in some, but not all, religious practices. This, of course, was the veneration of physical objects, known as idols, which spoke to their devotees through the casting of lots before them. It seemed odd to surrounding nations that the Jews should classify religious practices not by the interventionist efficacy of the God that was being worshipped, but rather by the manner in which that worship took place. The Hebrew Bible, that is to say, Tanakh, introduced the concept of idolatry to the world. In the course of some 4,000 years, the relentless prophetic attack on idolatry was replaced by a similar, but more intellectualized, rabbinic assault. Both the Torah and the Mishnah, which is the redacted law, are quite specific that idolaters are to be executed by stoning. The rabbinic extension found in the Gemara teaches that the denial of idolatry is to fulfill the entire Torah. This is a subtle and important concept. The idea that a positive course of action can follow purely from negative action, that is, from a repudiation, is called apophasis. This is sometimes called the via negativa, or the negative way. Since God admits of no multiplicity, we cannot meaningfully ascribe any traits or characteristics. Apophasis, or apophatic theology, seeks to learn what God is by understanding what God is not. I try to avoid buzzwords, but I do need to refer to this particular one. The attack on idolatry was a profound revolution. It flipped the discussion from what God is to what God isn't. This flowed directly from the unknowability of what God is. It also flipped the discussion on religious practice from what to do to what not to do. Even to the present day, the identification of idolatrous practice has been unique to the Near Eastern salvation religions of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. These are the religions which undertake to bring humanity to a place of safety. Each of these religions has made idolatry synonymous with contemptible and ungodly practices. The word idolatry is therefore a polemical term, not a simple descriptive. It is the subject of extreme imperatives in Tanakh, including a requirement to attack not just intramural idolatry, but also that of the Gentiles. The personal path of Jewishness, called the halakha, requires Jews to keep to themselves, except on this one issue of idolatry. Judaism has never been a proselytizing religion, but here are their standing instructions when they encounter idolatry among the Gentiles. Burn their idols. Do not touch the silver or gold they are made of. Do not take it, or it will be a snare to you, for it is horrible to the Lord your God. The first two of the 10 Commandments relate directly to idolatry. Even apart from that, these 2 commandments have a special importance in relation to the other 8. It was only the first 2 commandments that God spoke directly to the people. Indeed, they are the only 2 commandments in which God speaks in the first person to self-identify. Here they are. I will read the operative parts. You shall have no other gods before me. You shall not make for yourself an image in the form of anything in heaven above, or on the earth beneath, or in the waters below. You shall not bow down to them or worship them. But isn't this repetitious? If you truly have no other gods, then who could care about any carving of sculptures or painting of pictures or framing of mosaics? If one truly has no other God, we should be good, right? Well, no. This is because all 3 salvation religions came to regard idol worship both literally and metaphorically. Literally, yes, shaping physical gods out of stone or wood or metal is idolatry. But way more importantly, these religions condemned idolatry because they view the proper object of spiritual devotion to be exclusively the Creator and not any part of creation. As I shall explain, the highest and best expression of idolatrous belief denies, and indeed must deny, that creation ever took place. The best working definition of idolatry is that of the modern Brazilian philosopher and social theorist, Dr. Roberto Mangabeira Unger. He said, "Idolatry is confining infinite spirit within the perimeter of its finite constructions." My own definition is less precise, but it is easier to refer to quickly. That is, idolatry is confining the Creator to creation. So when I use the expression confining the Creator to creation, you will know what I am referring to. Idolatry is the religion that dares not speak its name. It has become synonymous with falsity and uselessness. No one ever claimed or admitted that their religion was idolatrous. The most thorough elucidation of idolatry is found in the work of the 12th century Sephardic Jew, Rabbi Moshe ben Maimon, also known as Maimonides or the Rambam. His bold and seminal work, the Mishneh Torah, was a complete compilation of Talmudic law. In it, the theme of proclaiming the unity of the Creator and the eradication of idolatry is not limited to the section specified for these topics. Rather, it permeates every section of this work as the purpose and foundation of the entire Torah. He wrote, "It is the object and center of the whole law to abolish idolatry and utterly uproot it." Maimonides was a staunch proponent of apophatic theology or negative theology. As I have explained, this is a theology which describes God as what God is not, rather than what God is. The identification of idols is, of course, the identification of what God is not. Maimonides' apophatic theology has endured. Just to take an example, the 20th century Talmudic humanist Erich Fromm declared that acknowledgement of God is fundamentally the negation of idols. Monotheism is the union of humanity against idols and idolatry. We Christians have a view of idolatry that is non-intuitive. The doctrines of the Incarnation and of the Trinity appear, at first blush, to be plainly idolatrous. That is, purporting to confine infinite spirit in a bodily construction, confining the Creator to creation. This has been, historically, the opinion of both Jews and Muslims about Christianity. And just think about it. Jesus stood up in the Holy Temple at Jerusalem on a rainy December day, sheltered in the cloister known as Solomon's Porch, at the Feast of Dedication, and said these words, "I and the Father are one." This statement is, on the face of it, idolatrous, confining the Creator to a person who is part of creation. I need to add some context. The Feast of Dedication is also known as Hanukkah. Hanukkah was, and still is, a celebration of the rededication of the Holy Temple after it was desecrated in the 2nd century BC by the Seleucid Greek warlord Antiochus IV, also known as Antiochus Epiphanes, who controlled the region as a successor to Alexander the Great. Antiochus deliberately provoked the Jews by placing a statue of the Greek god Zeus smack in the middle of the Holy Temple, and then sacrificing pigs on the altar. Against this idolatrous desecration, the Jews violently revolted in 167 BC under the leadership of Judas Maccabee. Astonishingly, and against all odds, the revolt was ultimately successful. And for a time, Jewish political sovereignty was restored. In the time of Jesus, this was fairly recent and very patriotic history, about as far in the past as the American Civil War is from us today. So, Jesus chose to make his idolatrous declaration at the biggest celebration of the defeat of idolatry in the entire Jewish calendar. And he did so at the very place where Antiochus committed his abomination of desolation, as it is called. I mean, was Jesus trying to get himself killed? The immediate and predictable reaction to his words was that everyone came at him to stone him to death, and he just barely escaped. There weren't a whole lot of loose stones lying about in the Holy Temple. But here's the point. Despite his obvious and thorough Jewishness, Jesus never once mentioned idolatry. The words idol and idolatry appear not once in the canonical Christian Gospels. Indeed, it is a bad topic for a walking, talking idol, and a Jewish one at that. Now, we Christians respond to this analysis by saying, with a straight face, that Jesus predated himself. That is, we reject the Arian contention, which I described in a previous video, that there was a time when Jesus did not exist. The Christian assertion is that Jesus was, in the words of our creed, begotten of his Father before all worlds. Now, okay, it's more than a little weird to say that a person born of a woman into historical reality is not part of creation. But that's my story, and I'm sticking to it. There is a theme in the history of idolatry that its practitioners frequently believe that with idols, bigger is better. My idol can beat up your idol because it is bigger and therefore stronger and more effective. In the book of Daniel, the Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar dedicated with great fanfare an idol of solid gold, 90 feet high and 9 feet across. My quick math says this would have required over $100 billion worth of gold at today's prices. That's one big, expensive idol. I'll just tell a quick story which is a kind of mini satire on this theme of big idols. The story concerns the prophet Abraham as a young boy, smashing his father's idols. The story starts off by identifying Terah, Abraham's father, as a manufacturer of idols. One day, while Terah is away, he entrusts his workshop to the young Abraham. A woman enters the idol shop to offer food to the idols. Abraham grabs a stick and smashes all the idols except the biggest one, in whose hand he places the stick. Upon his father's return, Abraham explains the disaster with obvious sarcasm. He tells his father that after receiving the food offering, the idols fought over who would eat first. And then the biggest one destroyed all the others with the stick. Terah stared at his son in disbelief. "Are you trying to fool me?" he asked. "These idols don't know anything." Abraham quietly replied, "Do your ears not hear what your mouth has just said?" This famous story does not appear in Tanakh. Rather, it comes from a part of the Jewish Midrash known as Genesis Rabbah. The Midrash is basically rabbis providing extrapolations of biblical texts, filling in blanks in Scripture. This story about Abraham is the only story in the Midrash, indeed, the only Jewish story post-Tanakh that also appears in the Holy Quran. Christian commentators have viewed the story as describing the transition from polytheistic idolatry to monotheism. Indeed, the story marks the precise birth of hereditary monotheism. Hereditary spiritually, for anyone interested, and hereditary with actual DNA for Jews, and I assume for at least those Muslims descended from Abraham's eldest son, Ishmael. This idea about the supremacy of the big idol later found its highest expression in an idolatrous philosophy that confined the creator to creation by saying there was no difference between the two. This philosophy is called pantheism. Some elements of pantheism are not new and trace their origins into classical antiquity. You can Google names like Heraclitus and Anaxagoras. However, 17th century Dutch philosopher Baruch Spinoza weaponized the concept as a rigorous confinement of the creator. Pantheism presented itself as a program of emancipation from superstition, magic, and other impediments to science. The word pantheism was coined shortly after Spinoza died in 1677 by the Irish philosopher John Toland. Pantheism emerged in ostensible opposition to the Middle Ages and all its superstition, but, critically, it could not gain traction without the medieval re-establishment of rationalism and the rationalist vocabulary of logic and of proof. Let me explain. By the end of the Middle Ages, it was clear that the salvation religions, despite their common origins, did not agree on the mechanism of the salvation they promulgated. However, certain parallel features had emerged. All three religions subscribe to the notion of a personal, transcendent, and ethical God who reveals herself to her creatures in history. There is another parallel feature, namely the abolition of prophecy. I will return to that concept later. Oh, and please note that, unless I am quoting someone else, I refer to God as she or her. This is because God's partaking at the table of philosophy is traditionally a feminine perspective. Christianity combined the personification of wisdom in Tanakh with the Platonic concept of wisdom to produce the concept of a female Hagia Sophia, or holy wisdom. While such identification of holy wisdom has been more pronounced in Christian Eastern Orthodoxy, Pope Leo the Great in the 5th century invoked the Book of Proverbs in describing the unborn Jesus in Mary's womb as wisdom building a house for herself. There is another aspect as well. True philosophy has no narratives. Women have been mostly left out of the scriptural narratives as primary actors, and so the feminine divine is best qualified to philosophize. To return to my argument, another parallel feature of all three religions in the late Middle Ages was the bear trap of rationalism. That is, the idea of the certainty and validity of formal proof. All three came to view reason as the chief source and test of knowledge. Faith and reason began to diverge into two regimes. For the first time, intellectuals in all three salvation religions felt compelled to prove the existence of God, just as the ancient philosophers of Greece and Rome used to do, that is to say, from principles of reason. This, for these salvation religions, was quite new. Previously, God's existence was simply thought to be self-evident in scriptural narratives, that is, the stories which make up Tanakh, the Christian Gospels, and the Holy Quran. This new idea about proving God required evidence of God that was not based in scriptural narrative, but instead in logic. To engage in these proofs, and there were a bunch of them, these thinkers dragged their religions into philosophy. Particularly, they revived the work of that great man, Aristotle, he of the astonishing 4th century BC in Greece. He was, and is, the undisputed founder of classical logic. This painting is by Rembrandt, by the way, and it shows Aristotle contemplating a bust of the poet Homer. This restless proving of God had its origins in efforts by two writers in Alexandria, in Egypt, to harmonize salvationist theology with Greek philosophy. It got underway with Philo of Alexandria in the 1st century AD. He was the first Jewish philosopher. He wrote an allegorical commentary on Scripture to show that the philosophy of Plato and Aristotle originated in the Torah. Heavy stuff. Then came Origen of Alexandria, a couple centuries later, who wrote the first systematic Christian theology. Up to that time, Christianity was still just a marginal folk religion practiced by slaves and illiterates. When a certain third-rate Greek writer named Celsus declared that no self-respecting philosopher of the Platonic tradition would ever be so stupid as to become a Christian, Origen wrote a rebuttal. He was the first to argue a rational basis for Christian faith. He was later declared a heretic. Anyway, he argued with Celsus that Christianity and Greek philosophy are not incompatible, and that philosophy is a worthy endeavor for a Christian. Such concern for academic respectability in the Hellenized world quickly diminished. It was only after the advent of Islam that the intellectual heavyweights of the salvation religions brought their skills to bear on classical rationalism. And they started at the most obvious point of overlap between philosophy and religion, namely, the proof of God. Something Immanuel Kant would later describe as ontotheology, and which Martin Heidegger would identify with the entirety of Western metaphysics and the complete degeneration of Western thought. This God-proving took place over 2 centuries in the work of these 5 major thinkers, 2 Christians, 2 Muslims, and a Jew. They were all highly committed neo-Aristotelians. I refer to them as the Gang of 5. The Persian Avicenna kicked off the proof parade. He wrote something called The Proof of the Truthful, which was a formal argument for proving the existence of God. Affirming and then applying Aristotelian principles, Avicenna argued there must be a necessary existent, that is, an entity that cannot not exist. That entity, he said, is God. His conclusion, therefore, was that God cannot not exist. This, of course, is a confinement of the Creator. This was the beginning of the modern imposition of theoretical limits on God, which follow from logical proofs, and which led to ever-increasing confinements of the Creator. We do not talk about him much today, but Avicenna was incredibly influential throughout both the Islamic and the Christian worlds. Then came Saint Anselm, also known as Anselm of Canterbury. This guy picked up on the tiny sliver of Aristotelian principles that leaked into the Latin West through the work of Boethius, someone I will mention again shortly. In his Proslogion, Anselm claims to derive the existence of God from the concept of a being than which no greater can be conceived. Anselm reasoned that if such a being fails to exist, then a greater being, namely a being than which no greater can be conceived, and which exists, can be conceived. But this would be absurd. Nothing can be greater than a being than which no greater can be conceived. So, a being than which no greater can be conceived, i.e., God, exists. It doesn't matter if you followed all that. I think Anselm would have been annoying at parties. The basic point here is that, for Anselm, the non-existence of God leads to a contradiction, and contradiction, for both Aristotle and Anselm, is sufficient to negate anything. Make a mental note, please, of this point about the tyranny of contradiction. Namely, that for these rationalists, it is sufficient to negate any conclusion about anything. Anselm was also profoundly influential. He was canonized as a saint, then made a doctor of the church, and ultimately became known as the Magnificent Doctor. Next up is Averroes, from Muslim Spain, or Andalusia, as it was called. He criticized Avicenna for not being sufficiently Aristotelian. He said Aristotle should be the preeminent guide in philosophy, and that philosophy should play a central role in religion, rather than being an alternative to religion. This was an important development, since the god of philosophy, both then and now, is typically considered without reference to the narratives of the salvation religions. In the game of philosophy, one must give up anything that guarantees a win. Some people today say it is improper to refer to him as Averroes, which is the bastardization of his name in the Latin West. But that's an important point. Averroes was so much a locus of discussion in Christian Europe that his name got slurred over in pronunciation. Many Christian writers simply referred to him as the commentator. Averroes accepted and repeated Aristotle's proof for the existence of God, namely, the necessity of an unmoved mover. But interestingly, he allowed there could be many unmoved movers. Averroes argued that God's existence has to be shown on the basis of the natural world, as Aristotle had done. Then comes the towering intellect of the Jewish scholar Moses Maimonides, who was a contemporary of Averroes in Muslim Spain, at least until Maimonides and his family fled to Africa following the abolition in 1148 of state protection for non-Muslims. He was yet another devoted exponent of Aristotle, whose works he called the pinnacle of unaided reason. Now, proving that God exists is a dicey business for Jews, since they typically interpret the first commandment to require them to accept the existence of God. What then could be the use of a logical proof? Wouldn't that be dangerous? Maimonides stepped up to the plate, however, and posited several proofs, but with a Jewish twist. He said, for instance, that the eternal motion of heavenly bodies implies an incorporeal infinite power. But he stopped right there because, he said apophatically, there are no words of comparison to describe God, whose essence is undescribed and unknowable. The Rambam would not presume to encroach upon the throne for which words fail. Similarly, the Rambam took issue with Avicenna's declaration that God cannot not exist. He said the lack of similarity between the divine and every other existing thing makes the attribution of existence to God equivocal. He was ahead of his time on that, as we shall see. Finally, we have Thomas Aquinas. This Italian-born, French-educated Dominican friar and priest was easily the greatest and most influential Christian philosopher of all time. He was intimately familiar with the other members of the Gang of Five, and he advanced 5 proofs of his own for the existence of God. I will not drag you through them. What is important is that all of his proofs drew on the observation of the natural world, specifically natural motion, natural causation, natural interdependency, natural measurement, and natural predictability. The result of all this religious rationalizing was predictable. These God-proving gang members unwittingly started an idolatrous trend of confining the Creator to creation by confining the concept of the Creator to what can be proved using logical concepts supplied by creation. I'll give the important part there again. Confining the Creator to creation by confining the concept of the Creator to what can be proved using logical concepts supplied by creation. This all became a runaway train in the 17th century, as I will explain. But I first need to make a detour into one particular principle of proof and of logic. All proof requires logic, and all logic hangs on a certain fundamental governing rule laid down by Aristotle. That rule is the law of non-contradiction. That is to say, nothing can be both true and false at the same time. Without this basic law in place, logic simply does not work. Its universality and predictability just drains away. Aristotle said that the law of non-contradiction was the supreme law over everything. He called it the most certain of all principles. For Aristotle, this was not just a principle of logic. He saw it as the tent pole that holds up the habitation of reality. He declared, the most certain of all basic principles is that contradictory propositions are not true simultaneously. This law is at the heart of all mathematical truth. This is what it looks like in the notation of formal logic. It is not the case that both P is the case and that not P is the case. That's sort of what logicians sound like. The law of non-contradiction has been, over the centuries, a very heavily defended citadel. It has been far and away the most obsessively defended principle in all of Western thought. Avicenna, he of the Gang of Five, obviously endorsed the law of non-contradiction, that is, the rule that a fact could not be both true and false at the same time. He had very harsh words for anyone who might dare to attack this rule, saying, anyone who denies the law of non-contradiction should be beaten and burned until he admits that to be beaten is not the same as not to be beaten, and that to be burned is not the same as not to be burned. Move forward 1,000 years, and you find that the world-renowned logician and part-time Welshman Bertrand Russell viewed the law of non-contradiction as the self-evident logical principle. Loyalty to this putatively eternal law of non-contradiction makes for strange bedfellows. It unites an evangelical atheist like Russell with modern Roman Catholics. There are several YouTube videos out there in which authorized Catholic theologians anxiously defend the law of non-contradiction and connect its certainty with certainty of the knowledge of God. Such slavish submission to the law of non-contradiction began, of course, with the Gang of Five. But you know how it goes. First you start proving God, then you start looking at what else to prove, then you start testing things to see what else can be logically demonstrated. And the next thing you know, the Renaissance arrives and you must cope with modern science. The Renaissance was supposed to be, as its name suggests, a rebirth of ancient learning. But as it evolved, it rebelled against the ancients and set out in a whole new direction. You see, in 17th century Europe, a profound change occurred in the instincts of intellectuals. It had been thought that forms are eternal, substance is variable. This came from Plato, who taught about the immutable, eternal essence that can only be participated in by material things. Think of how marble participates in a statue made of marble. Plato held that eternal forms, though they are not tangible, are of a higher reality than material objects. In late antiquity and in the Middle Ages, this teaching dovetailed with the Christian view of a higher, better existence than the material world. But along came science, and the persuasiveness of scientific discovery led to the a rejection of such superstition. The 17th century flipped the equation around to say substance is eternal, forms are variable. Science focuses on what substance is and how it behaves. Cramming substance into preconceived forms is useless to scientific endeavor. It just gets in the way. We therefore arrive at the eternality of substance, the primacy of substance and of the material world. Now, where does that concept get you? Well, here's where it gets you. Substance is eternal. God is eternal. God is therefore all substance, and vice versa. The idea of God as all substance, as being perfectly congruent with all creation, established the grandest, most perfect idolatry, an idolatry that venerates the biggest and most powerful idol imaginable. Remember the definition: confining the Creator to creation. Remember that bigger idols are better. Well, how about this idea? How about we confine the Creator to creation by saying that God is creation? Nothing more and nothing less. With the result that the created universe was never, in fact, created. The natural universe, that is all substance, is therefore all there is, or was, or could be, self-created and bound by its own set of discoverable and predictable rules. The totality of substance is therefore God, the biggest possible idol. This is called, as I have mentioned, pantheism, which is a word deriving from Greek roots pan, meaning all, and theos, meaning God. The basic concept is that all is God. This concept was, of course, the view of this guy. Baruch Spinoza was born into the Sephardic Jewish community in Amsterdam in 1632, at the very height of the 30 Years' War. That was the most traumatic and destructive European conflict prior to the 20th century. It was a religious war between Roman Catholics and Protestants. It was the bloodiest religious war in the history of the world. It depopulated Germany by over 50%. It ended in 1648 with the Treaty of Westphalia, when Spinoza was 16 years old. At the age of 23, Spinoza was expelled for heresy from his community, a Jewish kahila, which heaped on him every curse they could think of. Spinoza knew that publishing or teaching his thoughts would get him killed by the Dutch authorities, and so he lived the quiet life of a private scholar and supported himself as a lens grinder. He labored in obscurity and died in 1677 at the age of 45, after writing things that would change philosophy forever. To describe Spinoza's pantheism, I will not summarize his many arguments. Instead, I simply extract his key conclusions in 5 areas of thought, namely God, good and evil, free will and necessity, religion, and Holy Scripture. As you listen, I ask that you consider how his conclusions confine God to creation. Spinoza said about God that God is the sum of the natural and physical laws of the universe, and certainly not an individual entity or creator. God is a substance with an infinite number of attributes, but without personality or consciousness. God is just the sum of all the substances of the universe, and not anthropomorphic. God is the only substance in the universe, and everything is a part of God. There is only one substance, which is absolutely infinite, self-caused, and eternal. This radically unified substance is God, or nature, and these two terms are synonymous. Spinoza had an expression, Deus sive natura, God, that is to say, nature, or the nature God. Concerning good and evil, Spinoza held that notions of right and wrong have no meaning, since in nature there are no common norms, only individual desires. There is no essential good and there is no essential evil. The terms good and evil describe relations rather than essences. Good and evil are qualities defined by their usefulness and benefit. Usefulness and benefit are what assist what Spinoza called the conatus sese preservandi, the effort to preserve one's self, which, as a part of the natural order, is therefore also the will of God. In the 19th century, this conatus principle of Spinoza gave birth to Schopenhauer's will to live, and Nietzsche's will to power, and Bergson's élan vital. A consequence of confining the creator to a creation which is bound by natural laws is the denial that God exerts the personal privilege of free will. Spinoza therefore declared that the nature God is uncaused by any external force and has no free will. The essence of substance is necessity, meaning that substance does not depend on anything else, and that substance is the uncaused cause. The nature God is the cause of all things, because all things follow causally and necessarily from the divine nature. Now, this is an important one. The existence of the world is thus mathematically necessary. It is impossible that God should exist but not the world. According to the salvation religions, by contrast, God is a transcendent creator, a being who causes a world distinct from herself to come into being by creating it out of nothing. The Salvationists say God produces that world by a spontaneous act of free will, and could just as easily not have created anything outside of herself. Spinoza says, however, the nature God does not create the world by some arbitrary and undetermined act of free will. The nature God could not have done otherwise. Recall here Avicenna's declaration that God cannot not exist. Spinoza also justified his confining of the creator by deftly reversing the order of cause and effect in time. His assertion was that the nature God caused everything but created nothing, because creation implies temporality, and temporality, that is, the tyranny of time, compromises the nature God's status as eternal and perfect. This is an important pantheistic idea, that God is a closed loop with no purposeful characteristics. Even more important is the implication that to be in time is forever to be tyrannized by the changelessness of time. Spinoza was also an extreme determinist. He said, "Nothing in history or in nature could possibly have been otherwise. Everything is absolutely and necessarily determined. All talk of God's purposes, intentions, goals, preferences, or aims is just anthropomorphizing fiction and superstition. The nature God does not act according to purpose, but everything follows necessarily from the nature of the nature God, which, not surprisingly, is according to the laws of nature." Please note here the idea of the world as mathematically necessary, driven by the limitless perfection and universal application of mathematics. Spinoza made mathematical certainty the sole arbiter of truth. Spinoza did not have much use for religion. He said religious reverence gives rise only to superstitious behavior and subservience to ecclesiastic authorities, and is therefore not appropriate. The key to experiencing the nature God is philosophy and science, which lead to enlightenment, freedom, and true blessedness, which he defined as peace of mind. There is nothing holy or sacred about the nature God, and it is certainly not the object of any religious experience. There is no personal immortality, and death is only becoming more one with the nature God. Pleasure in itself is good. Hope, fear, humility, sacrifice, and repentance are bad. Self-preservation is the most fundamental emotion and the most fundamental virtue. So, what did he have to say about scriptural narratives? Basically, he said Scripture is garbage. He argued in both his Tractatus Theologico-Politicus and in the Ethics, his two main works, that the nature God is revealed to humans not through the revelations of Scripture, but through man's mind as a manifestation of the mind of the nature God. Spinoza formulated a resounding attack on the traditional concept of the Jews' election in his Tractatus Theologico-Politicus, rejecting the assertion that God chose the Hebrews above all nations. He claimed that this kind of choice would run contrary to God's nature. Spinoza portrayed the ancient Hebrews as a childish, vulgar people, contending that it was actually Moses, not any God, who had chosen the Jews, to bind them to his rules and convince them to uphold the covenant. Saying things like this, not surprisingly, got him expelled from his Amsterdam kahila with every curse known to Judaism. Make no mistake about it, Spinoza invented modern secularism. He was the first to argue that the Bible is not literally the Word of God, but rather a work of human literature, an anthology of ancient writings handed down over generations, and finally put together by a latter-day editor whose efforts attracted undue attention. Spinoza was essentially allergic to the relevance of sacred texts, and especially to the narratives contained in them. Truth for him must be presented and proved on the spot. No narrative has intrinsic value. There are no valid antecedents. Within pantheism, right up to today, the very idea of the preconceived notion is a polemical term, an idea or opinion formed beforehand without supporting evidence and associated with prejudice and bias. It is not surprising that Spinoza would add a gloss to Scripture that supernatural occurrences, namely prophecy and miracles, have natural explanations. Paradoxically, Spinoza was the undisputed founder of modern atheism, but all he talked about was God. He has been repeatedly called a God-intoxicated man. Spinoza emphatically agreed with Maimonides that the mind's highest good is the knowledge of God. He disagreed with Maimonides, of course, in that Spinoza's nature God has neither intelligence, nor feeling, nor purpose. Spinoza presented an impersonal, immanent, and determinist God as nature itself, a God who created nothing and has no plans for anyone. The nature God was the reverse image of the salvationist God. Where the salvationist God is personal, the nature God is impersonal. Where the salvationist God is transcendent, the nature God is immanent. Where the salvationist God is ethical, the nature God has no ethics, only useful behavioral norms. And of course, the salvationist God is self-revealing, and the nature God is, most importantly, entirely discoverable. Spinoza's cool, indifferent nature God differs from the concept of the anthropomorphic salvationist God who cares about humanity the way a parent cares about the progress of a child. The nature God, being just plain everything, is completely immanent, that is, completely present everywhere and in everything. Pantheism invites reverence towards the grandeur of the cosmos, which it equates with the nature God. But pantheism can be a bully about defending the regularity and predictability of mathematical certainty. Just as God has no choice but to exist as nature, nature must, like God herself, be perfect. When pushing a point like this, any philosopher, even Spinoza, is a tyrant without an army. As a result, you might guess that Spinoza would be very defensive about the law of non-contradiction, and you would be absolutely right. Spinoza has even been called the true high priest of non-contradiction. Spinoza's pantheism, which is the religion of unbiased science, requires the universe to make perfect sense, as could only be the case with a God who is congruent with the universe. Logical contradictions are scandalous heresy for the pantheist. For instance, both Spinoza and his contemporary, French philosopher René Descartes, saw mathematical logic as the absolute model of truth. To be true, a statement must be a mathematically measurable diamond, as one writer put it, obtainable only by cutting into reality with the cold, precise blade of formal logic. I'll give you this one example. Descartes advanced the idea that God is pure mind rather than simultaneous mind-body, making God, the supposedly perfect being, contradictorily imperfect, in the sense of being finite rather than infinite. Cool stuff. Tell it at parties. Anyway, Spinoza leapt on that to defend the law of non-contradiction, saying that Descartes' conclusion was contradictory and thus absurd. Absurdities such as this would need to be replaced with non-contradictory truths, he said. Suffice it to say, the law of non-contradiction remained firmly in place in Western thought right up until the 20th century, when it crashed and burned in spectacular fashion. And here I have to go right to the punchline and tell you that in 1931, a German graduate student named Kurt Gödel published his so-called incompleteness theorems, which proved that all complete mathematical systems are inconsistent. That is to say, they all produce contradictions. So goodbye, Aristotle. More on that shortly, God willing, and the creek don't rise. For now, I simply stress that until Gödel, no one in the West challenged the law of non-contradiction, except one extraordinary guy in the 15th century who wanted to toss the idea altogether. He was so very much ahead of his time that I need to tell you a bit about him. I'm talking about this guy. Nicholas of Cusa was a 15th century German scientist, theologian, lawyer, philosopher, churchman, and man of the world. He lived 2 centuries before Spinoza. Insiders call him Cusanus, or sometimes just Cusa. I will use all 3 names for him. In the sculpture you are looking at, Cusanus is the one on the left. This is probably what he looked like, given that it was carved by someone who knew him. He achieved a fair bit of what I would call ordinary, garden variety historical greatness. He, for instance, invented modern science. He anticipated many later ideas in mathematics, cosmology, astronomy, and, most especially, experimental science. For instance, he demonstrated that plants absorb nourishment from the air, and this was the first modern formal experiment in biology. He was also the first to prove that air has weight. He invented concave lenses to correct nearsightedness. Another Nicholas, named Copernicus, put the sun at the center of the universe in 1543. But Nicholas of Cusa declared 100 years earlier that the universe has no center at all. This puts him in good company with modern astrophysicists. He invented philology, the queen of the human sciences. He was the first to expose the donation of Constantine as an 8th century forgery, essentially creating the humanist discipline of philology, that is, the critical study of written texts. The donation of Constantine was a document that said Emperor Constantine in the 4th century had donated the whole of the Western Roman Empire to the Roman Catholic Church. The forgery had been used for centuries to prop up temporal papal power. He resolved the Great Schism of 1054, although it didn't last very long. Cusanus got the idea that he could reunite the Christian Church, which had divided into East and West, following acrimonious mutual excommunications in 1054 and thereafter. With the Pope's approval, he set sail from Venice in late summer 1437, bound for Constantinople, and he returned the following February. Astonishingly, he showed up back in Venice with both the Byzantine emperor and the Patriarch of Constantinople aboard his vessel. The voyage was a major success for Nicholas, especially when the ensuing Council of Florence proclaimed union between the Eastern and Western churches in July 1439. This rapprochement was fragile, however, and very short-lived. But as I will explain shortly, his voyage back to Venice was important for other reasons. He ended the Crusades. He did this by preventing a 5th crusade. He became a cardinal of the Roman Catholic Church in 1446 and nearly became pope. People listened to him. On May 29, 1453, Constantinople fell to the Ottoman Turks, led by Sultan Mehmet II. The cry went up in the Latin West to run to the assistance of the East in a mighty crusade. If not now, when? Cusanus responded to say the proper response to this should be quiet meditation, and specifically not a crusade to restore the Byzantine Empire, despite its having been the protector of Eastern Christianity for over 1,000 years. He said it was a time for reflection and not for war. In just a moment, I will have more to say about his not wanting to fight against Islam. He reinvented the Bible. Cusanus was a relentless church reformer, and the church at that time was rife with bad translations of Scripture. Even worse, the church itself was engaged in a horrendous and potentially violent debate over which of several translations was authoritative. The Pope put Nicholas of Cusa in complete charge of the problem, saying Cusanus could raise an army and go to war if that was what it took to sort out the Bible problem. Instead of an army, however, Cusanus turned to new technology, he teamed up with his contemporary and fellow German, Johannes Gutenberg, who had just invented movable metal type, and with it, the modern printed book. With impatient creditors trying to seize his equipment, Gutenberg was desperate to monetize his invention, and he targeted the Bible as the most profitable thing for him to print. But he couldn't get a straight answer from the church about which version of the text was good to go. Cusanus settled the textual dispute by calling a synod, that is, an official church meeting, in Mainz, Germany, where Gutenberg's little printing shop was located on the banks of the Rhine River. The result was the Gutenberg Bible, the world's first printed book. And he introduced multiverses. In his philosophical writings, he speculated over and again about the plurality of worlds. He envisioned the multiverse almost 5 centuries before the American psychologist and philosopher William James coined the word. And he introduced special relativity. Cusanus' thinking on this got started, he recorded, on that same fateful voyage back to Venice with the Byzantine emperor and the Eastern patriarch. Picture yourself on a boat, he tells us, sailing through a vast ocean. Unless you can see the shore recede behind you or the waters rush beneath you, you will think you are at rest no matter how fast you may be moving. Indeed, even if you do gaze down at the waters flowing by, you may at first perceive that they are moving while you are standing still. So it is, he said, with our position in the universe. Although the earth moves through a vast expanse of space, we perceive ourselves to be at rest, in the middle of the world, because we lack an unmoved point of reference. In 1905, Albert Einstein would tell us that rest and motion are wholly relative to the standpoint of the observer. Einstein knew nothing about Cusanus, but he arrived at Cusanus' conclusion that nothing is at the center of the universe, which means that everything is at the center from its own perspective. All this, as I say, are aspects of Cusanus' ordinary garden variety historical greatness. If you Google Nicholas of Cusa, you will see him described as a transitional figure with one foot in the late Middle Ages and another in the early Renaissance. Some writers even give him the nod as the greatest thinker of the 15th century. Some call him the first modern thinker. Well, ho-hum. Because you see, he achieved, in addition to all this, a special greatness as a true genius, albeit not recognized for many centuries. To explain this, I turn to 19th century German philosopher Arthur Schopenhauer's famous definition of genius. Talent is hitting the target nobody else can hit, while genius is hitting the target nobody else can see. The invisible target that Cusanus hit was his extraordinary realization that the law of non-contradiction was a complete fallacy, and he did this hundreds of years before Kurt Gödel in 1931. From Aristotle to Gödel, he was the only person to do this. In the 15th century, of course, no one noticed. The story goes that when he was 16 years old, Nicholas of Cusa left his home on the bank of the Moselle River in Germany and traveled to Italy, where he enrolled at the University of Padua to study law. It was likely from one of them that he got hold of an obscure Islamic manuscript written in Latin and entitled Lex Sive Doctrina Mahomet, which translates as the law, or that is to say, the teaching of Muhammad. His copy of this document survives, and in the margin of one of the pages, this future cardinal of the Roman Catholic Church wrote these words: Fides una, ritus diversus, or one religion in diverse rites. Cusanus spent the rest of his life pursuing that comment he made as a teenager. His core observation was that for the Holy Quran to agree that Jesus is the Christ and that the Gospels are true, and at the same time to deny that Christ is the Son of God, involves a contradiction. Nothing so fascinated Cusanus as much as a contradiction. It was much later, on that same voyage from Constantinople to Venice in February 1438, with the Byzantine emperor in tow, and when he was formulating his late medieval theory of special relativity, that he received what he later called a gift from above. That is, the idea that contradictions are resolved in infinity. This he called coincidentia oppositorum, or the coincidence of opposites. This idea played a decisive role for Cusanus in absolutely everything. The coincidence of opposites was the cornerstone of his thought, providing a method of thinking which restlessly examines things that are opposite and considers how those opposites coincide, even though the coincidence may not be understood or stated. Given that Christians and Muslims hold contradictory positions toward God's personality and revelation, both positions cannot be true. According to the law of non-contradiction, one must be true and one must be false. Within this logical framework, for the rationalist, the epistemic challenge consists in finding out which position is in fact true. Cusanus rejected this approach completely. Cusanus's greatest achievement was his conclusion that the law of non-contradiction does not always apply, and certainly does not apply to God. For Cusanus, Aristotle made a mistake when he argued that to posit a contradiction of contradiction would lead to an infinite regress, something medieval thinkers called ex falso quodlibet, or, in modern logic, an explosion, or, in ordinary language, anything goes. According to the principle of explosion, any statement can be proven from a contradiction, and Cusanus rejected that too. This was not just some casual observation for Cusanus. He said, "The primary weakness of all human reason is its acceptance of the law of non-contradiction as its most basic rule. Cusanus completely dismissed the law of non-contradiction, that is, the law stating that contradictories cannot be simultaneously true of the same object. He insisted that there is a coincidence of opposites in reality, especially in the infinite God. He blasted the Aristotelians for insisting on the law of non-contradiction and stubbornly refusing to admit the compatibility of contradictories in reality. It takes almost a miracle, he complained bitterly, to get people to admit this. Nicholas of Cusa ultimately concluded that unless one vanquishes lofty, arrogant rationality, one cannot pass through the entrance to paradise. He wrote this shortly after the fall of Constantinople. And I have found the abode wherein you dwell unveiledly, an abode surrounded by the coincidence of contradictories. And this coincidence is the wall of paradise wherein you dwell. The gate of this wall is guarded by a most lofty, rational spirit. Unless this spirit is vanquished, the entrance will not be accessible. Therefore, on the other side of the coincidence of contradictories, you can be seen, but not at all on this side. If then, O Lord, in your sight impossibility is necessity, then there is nothing which your sight does not see. Now, Cusanus was not the first to argue for the simultaneous truth of contradictory statements. For example, the Roman philosopher Boethius argued in the early 6th century that God's foreknowledge of history was a truth that existed simultaneously with the contradictory truth of human freedom to choose what happens in history. And Boethius himself may have stolen that concept from a 2nd century Jewish scholar, Rabbi Akiva, although I've not been able to connect those particular dots. Cusanus, however, was the first to suggest an entire philosophy which grounded itself on the coincidence of opposites, which, for rationalists, was, and is, a manifest absurdity. Later on, Nicholas of Cusa placed at the core of his greatest work, De Docta Ignorantia, that is, of learned ignorance, this idea that God is the coincidence of opposites as a truly infinite being. She includes all opposite and incompatible properties, therefore being all things and none of them. God has all properties, including contradictory ones. As I have already mentioned, in his scientific speculations, likewise, the Earth was displaced from the center of the cosmos. Cusanus came to believe that every point in the universe should be seen as a possible center of the universe, and all points as qualitatively similar. His project was to resolve every conflict of center and edge, of unity and multiplicity, with his principle of the coincidence of opposites. Towards the end of Cusanus's life, in 1458, Pope Pius II ascended to the papal throne. He was a close friend and admirer of Cusanus. He recognized Cusanus's abilities in transcending contradictions. The Pope asked Cusanus to return to the contradiction that had so inspired him as a teenager in Padua, namely, what derived from the rival religion of Islam. As a result, Cusanus wrote his remarkable Cribatio al-Qurani, the sifting of the Quran, finishing it in 1461. He described his method as being that of pia interpretatio, or pious interpretation. Cusanus was impeded by having a bad translation, and it is sometimes hard to figure out exactly what part of the Holy Quran he was referring to. However, he found and quoted one crucial statement that God not only desired diversity among humans, but actually required it. We have revealed to you, O prophet, this book with the truth, as a confirmation of previous scriptures and a supreme authority on them. So judge between them by what Allah has revealed, and do not follow their desires over the truth that has come to you. To each of you we have ordained a code of law and a way of life. If Allah had willed, He would have made you one community. But His will is to test you with what He has given each of you. So compete with one another in doing good. To Allah you will all return. Then He will inform you of the truth regarding your differences. This is the highest authentication of inclusion and diversity ever made within the salvation religions, or anywhere for that matter. Now, make no mistake that in his Cribatio al-Qurani, Cusanus cheered for the home team, that is, traditional Roman Catholic teaching. He was hardly going to report back to the Pope that he had found a better religion, or one just as good. But he managed to say things most extraordinary for a cardinal of the Roman Catholic Church. I mean, just check this. We must always strive to make that authoritative book for the Muslims applicable to us. Therefore, in the Quran, the splendor of the gospel shines forth to the wise. There had never been anything remotely like this from anywhere within the Christian Church, and the world waited until the Second Vatican Council in the mid-1960s to hear anything like it again. Renaissance thinkers, and those that followed, failed to adopt or even consider Cusanus's philosophy of contradiction. Instead, they doubled down on the Aristotelian law of non-contradiction and defended it with even more zeal than their medieval counterparts. The real value of the work of Nicholas of Cusa has only become apparent in the last 100 years or so, with the first scholarly treatise appearing only in 1926. I have one last thing to tell you about Nicholas of Cusa, the person. he was a pantheist. Wait, what? How can it be that this devout member of the church establishment subscribed to the most complete and committed idolatry? Easy. Cusanus's pantheism was driven by his acceptance of true logical contradiction, in stark contrast to Spinoza's savage rejection of the concept. That changes everything. Cusanus took his cue from the Epistle of James, that God is the giver of every best gift. The very best gift is God herself, and creation is the self-donation of God. God gives her very self in such a way that God and the creation are one. God is therefore the giver, the gift, and the recipient. Cusanus concluded, "Thus, it seems to be the case that God and the creation are the same thing, according to the mode of the giver, God, according to the mode of the given, the creation." Conceptually, of course, this is pretty tough sledding. For clarity, I defer to Professor Mary Jane Rubenstein, who is chair of the Religion Department at Wesleyan University and a singularly articulate apologist for pantheism. She admires Cusanus's pantheism. She writes, "The universe does not resemble a God who stands outside it. It resembles God only insofar as it embodies God everywhere, equally. It is with this insight that Cusa truly demolishes the graduated cosmos of his scholastic predecessors. God is not mediated down through the heavenly ranks to the lowly earth at its center. Rather, God is directly present to every part of the boundless universe." Professor Rubenstein goes on to explain that Cusanus replaced medieval hierarchies with what she and other modern writers helpfully describe as a holographic web. And so the order of things is not a static hierarchy under an extra-cosmic divinity. Instead, it is a dynamic holography in which God is fully and equally present to everything in creation. This radical indwelling is, for Cusa, what it means to make a world in the first place. Creating, he ventures in De Docta Ignorantia, seems to be not other than God's being all things. Now, this is a good moment to explain that not all pantheisms are as pure as that espoused by Spinoza. One variant proposes Spinoza's one regime, but with many regimes spread out holographically within it. This is the pluralistic, not monistic, pantheism preferred by both William James and Professor Rubenstein. Another variant of pantheism is called panentheism. It is similarly a have your cake and eat it too solution. So pantheism, all is God, we talked about that. Panentheism, all is in God. That is the meaning of the Greek words pan and theos, all in God. That is, creation is contained within the Creator, but the Creator extends beyond creation. In other words, God is greater than the universe. The critical and saving bit for many is that panentheism permits at least a small window into the transcendent and preserves that all too precious creator-creation boundary. Nicholas of Cusa did not slip off into any of these sideshows. He replaced the binary antagonism of immanence and transcendence with a completely different imaginative model, which is quite literally neither here nor there. For him, God is a sphere with her center everywhere, whereas the universe is a sphere with its center nowhere. Here is how he put it. The world machine will have, one might say, its center everywhere, and its circumference nowhere. For its circumference and its center is God, who is everywhere and nowhere. The dualism of immanence and transcendence has, for some time, tyrannized salvationist theology throughout the liberal West. Is God here, or somewhere else, or both? Only a very small number of theologians, such as Cusanus, are willing to say that this is the wrong question. Immanence, in philosophy and theology, is a term applied in contradistinction to transcendence. Immanence refers to the fact or condition of being entirely within something. It's from the Latin verb meaning to dwell in or remain. It is the theological conception of God as existing in and throughout the created world. The modern predicament of immanence and transcendence was acted out in real time in a fascinating chapter of Jewish history. Please indulge my brief digression. There was a concept in Judaism which came to me through the Lurianic Kabbalah, and which sounds something like panentheism. The concept here derives from the Hebrew word ha-makom, or the place. The expression is God is the place of the world, but the world is not his place. This sounds like something that might be a panentheist motto. All is in God, everything is in God, but God is greater than everything. Sounds harmless, depending on what the word place means. The Kabbalists who worked with this concept lived in Safed, or Sfat, in the Galilee region of Eretz Israel, following the expulsion of Jews in 1492 from Spain, and 5 years later from Portugal. Jews had lived in the Iberian Peninsula in relative peace for hundreds of years, and this peremptory expulsion came as a great shock. Some, like Spinoza's family, settled in Northern Europe. Others moved to Sfat and elsewhere in Muslim-controlled lands at the invitation of the Ottoman Sultan, Bayezid II. He saw an economic advantage in asking Jews to settle in his empire. Many writers say that Spinoza was inspired by the immanent sense of the divine that glowed like hot coals in Sfat. The phrase traces back to Genesis Rabbah, the very same 2nd century Midrashic text preserving the story about Abraham breaking the idols. The very first appearance of the phrase that I could find was even earlier, in the writing of Philo of Alexandria, whom I have mentioned. This amazes me. Philo, who was a contemporary of Jesus, is often credited with the first articulation of the doctrine of the Trinity. He is, therefore, arguably, the originator of both the Christian idolatry of the Trinity and the Jewish idolatry of pantheism. Smart guy. This rabbinic thought experiment about the place was popularized by the 16th century rabbi and mystic Isaac Luria, nicknamed the Ari or the Arizal, and for whom Lurianic Kabbalah is named. He pronounced a concept called Zimzum, whereby God is viewed as having contracted or shrunk, a thing called En Sof, which is a supreme divine light, for want of better words to describe it, to provide a conceptual place for finite realms to exist. And here is the tricky and interesting part about En Sof. You cannot declare that it exists. Because of this contraction, the divine self utterly transcends the role of creator, and creation represents a concealment, not a revelation of divine nature. For my money, this takes a good idea a little too far. I have trouble enough imagining transcendence without trying to transcend transcendence in this way. Just a little rich for my Episcopalian blood. Anyway, the idea of the Zimzum was a ticking time bomb that blew up at the time of the founding of the Hasidic movement in Western Ukraine in the 18th century. This was because of two interpretations, one literal and the other non-literal. The literal reading of the Zimzum narrative implies that the divine essence does not only transcend but is completely absent from the created process and the created realm. This is radical transcendence. The non-literal approach was taken by the Baal Shem Tov, a Jewish mystic who founded the Hasidic movement. He said that the divine essence is fully present in all creation and is merely concealed by the creative process. This is radical immanence, also known as pantheism. This is, on the face of it, a confining of God to creation. Not surprisingly, the Hasidic insistence of God being in all things generated many opponents, and that's exactly what they were called, the opponents, or in Hebrew, the mitnagdim, or sometimes mitznagdim, maybe some of them were French-Canadian. They are also referred to as Litvaks, because they were concentrated in Lithuania. One such opponent, a leading rabbi known as the Vilna Gaon, accused the Hasidim of saying, "Of every stick and every stone, these are your gods, O Israel." This was a phrase borrowed from the biblical episode of the golden calf, thus equating Hasidism with the worst possible example of public idolatry. Whether that was a fair assessment or not is none of my business, of course, but consider how interesting it is that Isaac Luria, Baruch Spinoza, and the Baal Shem Tov appear in a quick succession of 3 centuries, each with a unique pantheist vision. Okay, finally, to undigress, I sum up about Nicholas of Cusa by observing that his philosophy of true contradictions went very soundly asleep after his death. It stirred occasionally in the poetic imagination, as here in William Blake. There is a place where contrarieties are equally true. It is a pleasant, lovely shadow, where no dispute can come because of those who sleep. Interest in Cusanus reemerged only slowly, beginning in the late 19th century. The first to take him up as a figure of philosophical importance were the Neo-Kantians, Otto Liebmann and Hermann Cohen, the founder of the Marburg School. Soon after that, in 1913, British mathematicians Bertrand Russell and Alfred Whitehead issued the supreme confinement of logical inquiry to that which produces no contradiction. In their uber-rationalist, 3-volume Principia Mathematica, they sought to prove that mathematics is a discipline whose propositions can be exclusively expressed through the propositions of logic. The Principia Mathematica spawned a whole philosophical movement called logical positivism, whose central thesis was the verification principle. This theory of knowledge asserted that only statements verifiable through direct observation or logical proof are meaningful to convey truth, value, information, or factual content. Bertrand Russell and his followers rejected philosophical idealism, that is, a belief in a spiritual principle at the basis of the world. The driving force for this rejection was their conviction that reality is free of contradictions and that there is nothing true that cannot be proved. The Principia Mathematica was, and still is, for many people, a very persuasive work, despite the release of Gödel's theorems in 1931. It was this period, 1913 to 1931, that marked the lowest, bleakest point in the history of human intellectualism. I will leave you there, pulsing with suspense, until the next exciting episode in this series.
It is found again. What? Eternity. It is the sea, mixed with sun. It is found again. What? Eternity. It is the sea, mixed with sun. Found again. It is found again. What? Eternity. Mixed with sun. It is found again. What? Eternity. It is the sea, mixed with sun. It is the sea, mixed with sun. It is eternity, found again.
Income take over Bimber Bada, Zumayam Nayamom Mada.
It is the sea.